The Joint Defense Facility Pine Gap, photographed in 2014. Born at the height of the Cold War, the base near the town of Alice Springs was originally presented to the Australian public as a space research facility. Christian Lemler of Alice Springs, Australia. Margaret Pistorius arrived at court last week in her wedding dress, a bright orange and cream creation painted with doves, peace signs and suns with faces. "It's the colours of Easter, so I always think of it as being a resurrection dress," said Ms. Pistorius, a 53-year-old anti-war activist and devout Catholic, who on Friday was convicted of trespassing at a top-secret military base operated by the United States and hidden in the Australian outback. From the base, known as the Joint Defense Facility Pine Gap, the United States controls satellites that gather information used to pinpoint airstrikes around the world and target nuclear weapons, among other military and intelligence tasks, according to experts and leaked National Security Agency documents. As a result, the facility, dotted with satellite dishes and isolated in the desert, has become a magnet for Australian anti-war protesters. Over the past 2 weeks, Ms. Pistorius and 5 other Christian demonstrators were convicted in 2 separate trials of breaching the site's security perimeter last year. They could face 7 years in prison. Margaret Pistorius, a 53-year-old Catholic peace activist, was arrested last year for trespassing at Pine Gap. The base's role in U.S. military operations has made it a magnet for anti-war protesters. David Morris Smith for The New York Times, "In terms of actions like this, it's pretty basic. We're called to love our enemies," said Jim Dowling, 62, a member of the pacifist Catholic worker movement who was one of the protesters. "Do good to those who persecute you. To turn the other cheek. Put up our swords." All the teachings of Jesus on non-violence. The trials, and the Australian government's uncompromising prosecution of the protesters, has put a spotlight on a facility that the United States would prefer remain in the shadows. At the height of the Cold War, Pine Gap was presented to the Australian public in 1966 as a space research facility. But behind the scenes, the station was run by the CIA to collect information from American spy satellites about the Soviet Union's missile program. Since then, American spies, engineers, cryptologists and linguists have flocked to Alice Springs, the small town closest to the base, to work at the facility. At least 599 Americans lived there in 2016, according to the latest census. Though their presence in town is low-key, there are some telltale signs: a baseball diamond at a local sports complex, Oreo cookies and Dr. Pepper in the supermarket, and beef brisket on sale at a butcher shop. Americans, from the time they came here, have never been isolated from the rest of the community, said Damian Ryan, the mayor of Alice Springs, who could remember a time when Americans in left-hand drive cars were frequently seen on the town's roads. "They've been part of the community the whole time." A satellite image of Pine Gap from October. Inside the white spheres, called radomes, are antenna systems that send and receive information from dozens of satellites. TerraServer Digital Globe. The base is reached by a dead-end road, marked with a sign warning away visitors. Without clearance, the only way to see Pine Gap is by air, or by climbing the craggy ridges of the McDonnell Ranges that surround the site. Photos taken from the air show a sprawling campus punctuated by white geodesic domes that look like giant golf balls. Inside these spheres, called radomes, are antenna systems that send and receive information from satellites in constant orbit above the Earth. The staff at Pine Gap was predominantly American until the 1980s, when the two governments, responding in part to public pressure here, made it about half Australian. Today, more than 800 people from both countries are believed to work at the base. But the United States is firmly in control. Pine Gap has changed and developed enormously, said Richard Tanter, a senior research associate at the Nautilus Institute, an honorary Melbourne University professor who has investigated and criticized the base for years. In documents leaked by Edward Snowden, the American intelligence contractor turned whistleblower, Pine Gap is described as playing a significant role in supporting both intelligence activities and military operations. Defendants with supporters this month in Alice Springs, where their trials were held. The proceedings have put a spotlight on a facility that the United States would prefer remained in the shadows. David Morris Smith for The New York Times. What that actually means, Professor Tanter said, is that the station is involved in real-time contributions to the United States' global military operations in Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. Pine Gap, he added, also contributes data for CIA drone operations in countries in which the United States is not at war, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan and so forth. It is also critically important in whatever the United States is going to do on the Korean Peninsula. Professor Tanter has gleaned information about the secret site from unexpected public records, including the LinkedIn profiles of Pine Gap contractors and satellite photos that reveal new construction at the site. Professor Tanter, who is president of the Australian Board of the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, said he wanted the government to make a very clear-headed assessment of whether it is in Australia's best interest to contribute data for drone assassinations and targeting nuclear weapons. Other experts, however, said that hosting a base like Pine Gap helps maintain the country's alliance with the United States, and that other partners of the Americans carry considerably larger burdens. The defendant Jim Dowling, 62, of the pacifist Catholic worker movement, appeared in court barefoot. In terms of actions like this, it's pretty basic. We're called to love our enemies, he said of the protest at Pine Gap last year. David Morris Smith for the New York Times. Australians are not doing a lot of things that our allies are doing, including permanently hosting American nuclear weapons and soldiers, said Stephen Fruehling, a professor at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre of the Australian National University. Last year, in the early hours of a cold, dark September morning, Mos Pistorius, Mr. Dowling and 3 other peace pilgrims, as they call themselves, breached Pine Gap's security perimeter. As the activists scrambled up a rocky hill to get closer to the base, and with the police moving in, Mos Pistorius picked up her viola. Another protester strummed his guitar. As they played a lament for those killed in war, Mr. Dowling held up a large, laminated photograph showing a bloodied young woman with her foot missing. A 6th activist, Paul Christie, 44, carried out his own protest at Pine Gap days later. He was tried separately and convicted last week, charged, like the others, with entering a prohibited area. During the activists-backed outback trials this month, a modest band of supporters gathered at the courthouse. Many were members of the country's anti-war movement, parts of which are religion-infused. A Quaker knitted flower brooches. A Buddhist brewed coffee from the back of his van. A collection of colorful banners tied to fences read, "Close Pine Gap," and "End the U.S. Alliance and Pine Gap Terror Base." The base is reached by a dead-end road, marked with a sign warning visitors away. David Morris Smith for the New York Times. Mr. Dowling, who said he had been arrested between 50 and 100 times, was found guilty once before of trespassing at Pine Gap, in 2005. The conviction was later overturned. One of his co-defendants this time was his 20-year-old son Franz, the guitar player at the protest last year. The younger Mr. Dowling and 2 other defendants, Andrew Payne, 31, and Timothy Webb, 23, live together in a Dorothy Day Catholic worker house in Brisbane, where they regularly take in homeless people. All 5 were found guilty of entering a prohibited area, and Mr. Payne was convicted of an additional charge of possessing a photographic device. During their trial, the 5, who acted as their own attorneys, tried to argue that they had acted in the defense of others, but Justice John Reeves did not allow it. Pine Gap has to bear a big responsibility for all the murder and mayhem that has taken place in Iraq and Afghanistan, said Jim Dowling, who appeared in court barefoot. Mr. Dowling seemed unperturbed by how few activists had traveled to remote Alice Springs to support him and the other defendants. There's not a huge number engaged in nonviolent resistance in the name of their faith, but numbers don't matter, do they? He said. Just follow your conscience, do know. Correction. November 24, 2017. An earlier version of this article misstated the age of Timothy Webb, one of the activists who were convicted on Friday. He is 23, not 26.